Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are gathered tonight to celebrate all our families, disability lineage, and the future of kinship with the author, Jennifer Natalya Fink, and conversation partner, Ralph James Savarese. Actually, Ralph, I should have asked how to pronounce your last name. I may have just butchered it in my own Southern accent. I apologize. You'll correct me when you come on. I will introduce Ralph first. He is the author of 5 books, including Reasonable People, A Memoir of Autism and Adoption, and See It Feelingly, classic novels, autistic readers, and the schooling of a no-good English professor. He is also the co-editor of 3 collections, including the first on the concept of neurodiversity. A 4th co-edited collection, The Futures of Neurodiversity, is presently under contract. His latest book of poetry, which he co-authored with Stephen Kusisto, Someone Falls Overboard, Talking Through Poems, came out last fall from 9 Mile Books. He can be seen in his son DJ's Peabody Award-winning documentary, Deej, Inclusion Shouldn't Be a Lottery, and he teaches at Grinnell College in Iowa. So welcome, Ralph. And the person of the hour is, of course, Jennifer Natalya Fink. Jennifer is the director of the program in disability studies and a professor of English at Georgetown University. She is the author of 6 books and founder of the Guerrilla Press, a nonprofit promoting youth literacy through bookmaking. Fink is the winner of the Dana Award for the novel and the Catherine Doctorow Prize for Innovative Fiction, as well as a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award. First and foremost, she is a mother. The transformative experience of parenting her autistic daughter is at the center of her work. Tonight's event is American Sign Language interpreted by Crystal Hardy. Thank you to Crystal for joining us tonight. And thank you to all of you at home watching with us. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to write your question in the Ask a Question tab or in the chat, and I'll be sure the presenters see it. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and please enjoy the show.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight amidst war, COVID, and all the rest. Happy Thursday, slouching toward Good Friday, also known as Passover. I'm Jennifer Natalya Fink. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am a white middle-aged woman in a black shirt and pink scarf with black curly hair in a bun against a white background. Welcome. I'm so delighted to be here tonight to share all our families, disability lineage, and the future of kinship with you, and to be in conversation with a truly groundbreaking, trailblazing, brilliant thinker and fellow traveler, Ralph James Savarese. I am coming to you live from unceded Piscataway Nechkachunk territory in glamorous Gaithersburg, Maryland. I encourage you, yes you, to take a moment to Google whose territory you are on. All you need to do is put in the old Google, whose territory am I on? And Google will tell you. Pause for the 10 seconds it takes to find that out. And now you cannot unknow that, right? So personally, I kind of hate it when some white lady in, let's say, a black shirt and pink scarf gets up and makes this kind of virtue signaling proclamation if it's not backed up by action. So let's turn this statement of fact into a call to action, a call to restorative justice for Nechkachunk, Piscataway, and all BIPOC people. I invite you to join me in that work. One first step, if you go to nativegov.org, you'll learn about this whole land acknowledgement business. Piscatawaytribe.org to learn more about Nechkachunk Piscataway in the present and work underway in Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware on land reclamation, and NARF.org for more information about how to turn these statements, which make everybody feel good, into real substantive change. Now, a few adjustments of my scarf and a few quick thanks to Joanna Green, my editor, and the whole Beacon team. I want to thank Amanda Annis, my amazing agent at Trident Media, who helped me turn what was really just a glimmer of an idea into a book. Here it is. Wow, it's a book now. And thanks to the Charis team, especially E.R. Anderson, for their hard work making this event happen, and to Crystal Hardy for the ASL interpretation. I so appreciate that Charis is providing ASL translation and captioning. It really matters to make things accessible. Thanks to all my families, especially my daughter Nadia, the joy and center of my life, and Sarah Sohn, my partner in parenting, and much more. Thanks to Rona and Cousin XY, who you'll be hearing about in a second, Grandma Adina, Shalif Lewis, and all our disabled kin. Sikrona Libroka, their memory is a blessing. Let their memory be a revolution. So I'm going to begin at the beginning, as it were, and read the opening gambit, which frames the problem that I'm interested in this book, how delineating disability from family leads to trauma and ableism. And I'm also discuss and maybe read later, I'm going to read a teeny bit of the end as well, which offers, I don't want to say solutions, that's kind of overstating it, but some ways into rethinking, solving, rearranging this problem. You'll have to read the book to see how I get from that problem to the solution. And then Ralph will read as well, and then we'll have a chat, and perhaps you can chat back. And I'm actually going to read from the actual physical book. I'm 7. I'm walking through room after room in my grandparents' cavernous Long Island home, looking for my cousin. Cousin, cousin, I call, wishing I knew his name. Cousin XY? I know he's a boy, and I'm a geneticist's daughter. Chromosomes count. Cousin XY visits me in dreams. He has his father's eyes. My cousin XY was born in 1972 with Down syndrome and immediately abandoned to a state institution. He was listed only as baby XY. I always knew my aunt and uncle gave away their son at birth. His very existence was explained to me as a tragedy, a crisis, an aberration that perhaps science could one day prevent. In the hospital on the day he was born, his mother refused to look at his face, take him away, or so the story went. My grandfather, a family doctor, the family medical expert, was firm. Give him up. You can start over. You have a right to real children. He will be happier there. Where was there? I often wondered where my cousin was, who he was. Silence and 2 neurotypical children quickly replaced him in the family narrative. On the rare occasions when his existence came up, everyone gave them away was repeated as gospel truth. And indeed, in the 1970s, institutionalization, abandonment, and excision from the family narrative was still too often the fate of those labeled incurable at birth. But I discovered that wasn't the whole truth. As with most families, the story of my family's disability lineage had far more strands than I realized. In 2017, when I was visiting a far-flung branch of my family in Manchester, UK, I discovered there was another cousin in my family with Down syndrome. Also on my father's side, buried in plain sight, Rona. Born in Scotland in 1946, 2 decades before cousin XY, Rona lived in apparent happiness, first with her nuclear family in Glasgow, and then in a group home called Cosgrove, which her mother helped found for disabled Jewish people. True to her name, Rona means joy in Hebrew. She lived a joyous Jewish life. 2 of my family members have been written out of the family story, delineated from our lineage. I mourned what I never had, both a lived relationship with my cousins and a family myth that could include them. I wondered how the knowledge of a rich, deep history of disability in my family would have changed my experience of my own daughter's diagnosis at age 2 as a disabled, non-speaking autistic person. If I had grown up playing with cousin XY, would we have experienced her disability as just part of the warp and woof of our lineage, instead of as a personal disaster, rending us from the fabric of family? So these were the questions that led me to think about disability lineage and what the implications of repressing, hiding, finding, and celebrating it might be for disabled people and their families everywhere. By cutting me off from knowledge of my disabled cousins, I had no source of disability knowledge and history in my family. Their lives were treated as extraordinary, disposable, and traumatic. So traumatic that the very fact of them was hidden, erased from the story our family told about itself. So I'm really interested in the stories families are telling about themselves and the way they leave out, erase, or only represent disability as traumatic. So it's not just about, the actual cutting off of family members, which is less common now than in the 1970s, but the story told. And this is typical of how disability is narrated in the family myths passed down from one generation to another. Disability is erased, repressed, covered over. Families delineate, destroy the connections between generations of disabled people, their families, and their caretakers. Our disabled kin are not merely misrepresented, they are written out of the story. By examining the way families excise disability from stories, bless you, I began to see how disability is fundamentally shaped by this omission. The way we assign meanings to bodies and minds, establish norms, and otherize and stigmatize according to perceptions of ability is inseparable from how we name and claim our kin. Family is defined and produced by eradicating disability lineage, often making the inevitable appearance of disability within a given family a crisis, a trauma, to be erased, effaced, unwritten. I refer to this process as delineation, the separation of disabled people from their lineage. The word delineate literally means to mark off with lines and separate. It includes the word lineate, derived from lineage, family ancestry. You can see I'm an English professor here, right? The delineation I'm examining here is sometimes literal, as with the institutionalization of my cousin XY. It's sometimes rhetorical, as with the suppression of my cousin Rona and her disability from this family narrative. But here's the interesting thing. Delineate also means to describe or portray. Like I'm delineating the problem here, right? Which is a form of inclusion. So within the word itself lies the potential to relineate, to sew a family member back into the fold, to describe, portray, and thus connect. And what would that look like? So I'm going to read just 2 other little sections to give you a sense of what I mean by this sort of relineation. And there's sort of 2 facets of it, and I'll address both. Give me 1 second. Okay. So it's going to look like I'm giving you the finger, but I'm not. It's okay. It's my ring finger. And there's a purpose to this. I wear my grandmother's ring on my 4th finger. It's an intricately carved, quirky little number, a garnet precious only to me. I'm married to my grandmother, I say to anyone who asks. It's a queer form of irony that marks my longest, deepest love, Adina Shalif Lewis. a tiny, eccentric leftist who adored me, Jewish folk dancing, and Adele Davis's health food regime, possibly in that order. Though she was a terrific student who tutored all the other kids, her father made her drop out of high school because she was a girl. Adina found a way out of poverty through a Jewish socialist community in New York, where she met and married my grandfather, Harold Hal Lewis, an educator and artist. Adina never worked outside the home, couldn't drive, and never wrote a check in her entire life. My grandfather managed everything, even by the standards of their generation's strictly defined gender roles. My grandparents were extreme. Yet they had one of the most loving partnerships I've ever witnessed. And in their retirement home, the staff dubbed them the lovers because they were always holding hands or walking with the arm of my tall, handsome grandfather wrapped around my tiny grandmother's fragile frame. Only after they passed did I consider the way disability shaped this incredible partnership. Adina Shalif Lewis was deaf. She hated her hearing aids and couldn't really lip read. She was hard of hearing from birth. I'm not exactly sure when she became officially deaf. My grandmother spoke of disability with disgust. She saw disabled children as disposable tragedies. Ugh. I can see the face she made when disability was mentioned. Tragic, but also disgusting. Was that how she felt about her own hearing impairment? Grandma Adina spoke in a near shout in heavily Yiddish-inflected Brooklynese. When she'd call my sister at college, her roommate would say, "Your grandmother's calling from Russia." She just couldn't even understand my grandmother is speaking English. No, not Russia, Westchester. They're similar. Fearful of the outside world, she was seemingly content to be a Balabusta, sort of super housewife with left-wing leanings who insisted that feminism meant the right to stay at home. We had a lot of debates about this. Completely cut off from any notion of disability as a positive identity or culture, Adina Shalif Lewis was the most brilliant, loving presence in my life. She found everything I did worthy of celebration and made light of any annoying character traits I revealed. You can see why I miss her. My mother inherited her impaired hearing, but not her shame. My mother lip reads, and she wants you to know she only became deaf in her 60s, purchases every possible gadget to access or amplify sound and language, and religiously wears the latest and greatest hearing aids. Whereas Grandma Adina appeared to have little ambition, my mother went from a working class Brooklyn childhood to a marriage to a prominent scientist, to a career as a high school special ed teacher, to, at age 50, a PhD from Harvard, and a second career as a college professor. She has published 3 books and has dedicated her life to training special ed teachers and researching dyslexia. She could not be more interested in the outside world. Her hearing impairment has increased steadily over the course of this noteworthy career. Yet only as I was finishing writing this book did I think of including 2 of the people closest to me, the women who formed me, who loved me the most, one whose ring I wear on my finger, and the other whose smile I wear on my face. I didn't think of including either of them in my disability lineage. Shame and stigma about disability are so great that I had internalized them, unconsciously refusing to acknowledge that my very own mother and grandmother were disabled. For I would have had to confront another facet of my ableism, my own fear of deafness. In developing a disability lineage, this is the point, we not only uncover lost, hidden, disappeared family members who were institutionalized, abandoned, murdered in some cases, or otherwise cut off from the family tree, we may also discover that the family members who we never even thought of as disabled, who perhaps never thought of themselves as such, were and are disabled. By valuing the diversity of body minds among our kin, we rediscovered the disability lineage right in front of our eyes, their deaf ears listening intently, right across the dinner table from us. We also confront their erasure, how marginalized or otherwise mistreated they were because of their disabilities. It's not that disability lineage is always hidden away. It was right there in front of us, but shame and stigma kept us from seeing it as our inheritance. So it's not just people are eradicated from the story, they're in the story, but not present as disabled. So I'm going to read one little passage more about what do we do, how do we do this differently, or try to at least. And I kind of laugh when I see what the subtitle is. It's so grand. Rending and Mending the Fabric of the Universe. Who wrote that? Oh, I did. Okay, Jennifer. Though we planned for 2 years, COVID-19 made us turn my daughter Nadia's bat mitzvah into a gil mitzvah, a sort of preamble to the main event. Nadia prepared Torah commentary. I prepared to cry. We chose her dress together. We went online to Bloomingdale's, Grandma Adina's favorite store. I'm outing my bougie tendencies here. She, Grandma Adina, adored the discounts and the unsweetened soft-serve yogurt. Even Adele Davis would approve, right? Nadia adored all the dresses. I can't choose, she typed. Pick 2, I suggested. She chose 3. We ordered and hoped for the best. The purple plaid one with the unlikely metallic pink accents she finally chose to wear was gorgeously blingy and fit perfectly. Grandma Adina loved such unlikely color combinations. The gil mitzvah was more moving than I had imagined anything on Zoom could be. Nadia's words, Nadia's prayers, Nadia's thoughts, Nadia's passion for Torah, for questions of God and speech and silence. Only when I was looking at the haphazard iPhone pics I took of us afterward did I notice how Nadia's woven plaid echoed Rona's taffeta that I saw in a photo. Same pattern, same confidence. The term lineage itself gestures towards this expanded sense of belonging, meaning, a collective as well as individual ancestry. This double sense of heritage is precisely where disability lineage and ancestry meet, where our personal family histories and personages join with the larger ancestral memory. I pray to my deaf grandmother. I remember all our disabled grandmothers. A sense of belonging to a greater story is integral to all humans, right? In imagining a future in which I will certainly be disabled if I'm so lucky to be alive, I have my deaf grandmother to guide me. Grandma Adina can show me how to live joyously with the disability that she disowned during her own lifetime. I've Rona now, reclaimed and Uncle Sass to help me better understand and care for my daughter. And I have Cousin XY, whose absence still haunts me, but whom I feel more deeply connected with after this deep dive into our disability lineage. In my dreams, he plays cards with me in my grandfather's basement. Thank you. Over to you, Ralph.
Thanks a lot. First of all, it's a tremendous pleasure to be doing this event with you, and also an honor. I am a old, bald, white guy in a blue shirt coming to you from Iowa City, Iowa. In the background, there's a poster from my son DJ's film, Lineage. For those who don't know me, 25 years ago, I adopted from foster care a non-speaking 5-year-old boy with autism who was said to be profoundly retarded. Quotes around that term. He had been horrifically abused in foster care. And jump ahead, he was Oberlin College's first non-speaking student with autism, graduated Phi Beta Kappa with a double major in anthropology and creative writing. He wrote, starred in, and co-produced his Peabody award-winning film called Lineage, which maps his inclusion journey. And so I come at the issue of disability and family from a slightly different perspective of making a new family, because I didn't much care for my birth family. And what's involved in imagining, before you really know what you need to know, a radically different future, especially in the face of what experts and people said about my son. And what's it like to build self-esteem in a child who was thrown away? So I'm going to read a piece that I wrote and published in 2009 because it really resonates, I think, with Jennifer's book. And it invokes the story of the playwright Arthur Miller, who abandoned his own child with Down syndrome, never saw him until the end of his life, and was shocked to see that his child was living mostly independently and doing just fine. So this piece takes up that story in the context of my son DJ's life. So the title is, Do You Doubt My Puberty? As a freshman in high school, I had a bit part in a community theater production of Arthur Miller's The Crucible. With John Proctor raging against the trial that would convict him of witchcraft, Judge Danforth was supposed to exclaim, "Do you doubt my probity?" But instead, the roly-poly adolescent playing him yelled, "Do you doubt my puberty?" Which elicited tremendous guffaws from the audience. The kid's puberty was indeed in doubt. Baby fat and a squeaky voice made it almost impossible to accept the high seriousness of the drama. With one slip, this famous American tragedy turned tragically comic. Even at the end of the play, as Proctor was being hanged, and as Miller's implied critique of McCarthyism resounded, some in the audience were still guffawing. I thought of this gaffe when my 16-year-old son, a sophomore with autism, asked on his talking computer, "Will I ever get to have sex?" "Yes," my wife and I responded, committed to the creative problem solving we'd practiced from the moment our adopted son arrived in diapers and carrying the label of profound mental retardation at the age of 6. That little boy is now a young man. This is back in 2009. He's 5'10". He's shaving. He's also a straight A honor roll student at our local high school. He has appeared on CNN with Dr. Sanjay Gupta and given speeches all over the country on the importance of self-determination. What's a little sex compared to the obstacles he's already overcome? I mused. In effect, my son was asking, "Do you doubt my puberty?" But for him, as for so many other people with cognitive differences, the issue isn't humorous at all. When you consider the shame that people attach to disability generally and the near hysteria that greets disabled sex in particular, my son's concern shouldn't surprise anyone. Just 2 years ago, America learned that Arthur Miller fathered a boy with Down syndrome, a boy he abandoned at an institution and never told anyone about. Only at the end of his life did this defender of the politically oppressed bother to visit his son. When he did, he was reportedly shocked that the 40-year-old Daniel had a job and lived largely independently. A year earlier, the media reported on a girl whose parents had authorized the removal of her breast buds and uterus and the injection of high doses of estrogen to prevent puberty and keep her small. The parents thought it would be easier to care for Ashley, whom they dubbed the Pillow Angel, when she was older, and a hospital ethics board approved this growth attenuation for static encephalopathy. The hospital, however, violated state law by not submitting the procedure to court review. The public uproar was tremendous, and one of Ashley's 2 doctors ended up committing suicide. Many supported the procedure, but an adult woman with the very condition, static encephalopathy, who communicates by pointing at a vertical letterboard, criticized the, quote, readiness with which Ashley's parents, doctors, and most commentators assumed they could make an accurate estimation of the understanding of a child without speech, who has severely restricted movement, end quote. As the woman, Anne McDonald, a great disability rights warrior, if there ever was one, explained, the presumption of a lack of intelligence governed their attitudes. On the whole, we've come a long way from the incarceration, sterilization, and eugenics of the 20th century, but not far enough. The dream of full participation in life's richness for those with cognitive differences remains just that, a dream. Who of us doesn't want a job, a home, and friends? Who of us doesn't want a share of that sublime and affirming activity we call sex, or what my son at age 12 memorably termed great feelings? We need to stop behaving like Puritans and provide people with disabilities with rigorous sex education. Not only that, but opportunities, even trained sexual facilitators, if need be. Kids with disabilities grow up. Let them look forward to what the rest of us look forward to. We can do this responsibly, ethically. A journalist covering the Arthur Miller story suggested that in the forsaken relationship with Daniel, Miller was sitting on his greatest unwritten play. Thank God for Jennifer's book. That's a little ad lib there. My own son just received a Division I rating in the state theater competition with a work about autism that he wrote and helped to direct. It's called Plotting Hope. And I like to think of it as filling a void that Miller simply couldn't imagine. So I'm just going to read two short little poems, one by my son, DJ. When we got DJ, he was so injured and anxious. He'd really been tortured in foster care. So one of the things I'm proudest of with respect to my own personality is that I do things that most people don't do. For example, I built an indoor trampoline house in Iowa with a karaoke machine and a bar, and netted ceilings going to this. Netted sides going all the way to the ceiling. So I bought my first trampoline 2 days after DJ came to live with us. And this is his take on my buying this trampoline. And it's in a Pantone form where the interlocking lines are repeated as the poem moves forward, almost like a slinky. So the poem's called My Adoptive Father Buys a Trampoline. And we were living in Florida at the time. Like newly laid asphalt, the black mat baked in the Florida sun, at once taut and spongy. This ridiculous highway, which sat baking in the Florida sun, afforded my father and me the most ridiculous of highs. We bounced up and around, my new father and I, on this improbable racetrack, up and around, bouncing like Herbie the Love Bug, his racetrack just as improbable as ours. My new name, not Herbie the Love Bug, hugged me like a guardrail. A new Italian last name was just what a foster kid needed, hugging me like a guardrail on newly laid asphalt. It's a really difficult form. I've never been able to pull one off, but you can see that it comes back to the first line of the poem. So I'm going to read a poem that gives voice to my greatest fears as a 58-year-old man who has started to imagine what my son's life might be like in a world that really hasn't progressed as much as it needs to. And my son thinks that I have undersold his capacity to survive under very difficult circumstances. That could be true. I'll leave that up to you. So this poem is called The Big Ask. People do miraculous things. Mostly they don't. My friends J and G adopted their colleague's adopted daughter when the colleague got sick and died with great rapidity. The colleague had no immediate relatives. The girl had been born in China. Like a development officer at a college or a foundation, the colleague would have preferred to soften my friends up slowly, but she had run out of time. And anyway, hospitals believe in speed dating. They can make a donor of anyone. Tubes turn gasps into poetry. Death, the ultimate coach and editor, said, cut this, cut that, now make the big ask. Will you please love my child? My friends knew the girl. In fact, they were her godparents. They had raised 2 daughters and been looking forward to their silver years. Golden ones are for people with money. But they stepped up, as we like to say. The heart has a podium and life is a speech. When we adopted our son, the DCFS workers insisted we undergo a second background check. She couldn't understand why an educated couple who didn't believe in God and whose own reproductive equipment worked just fine would adopt a child with a significant disability. She feared that we might be predators. When I die, please put me in a glass box and place it in my son's room, wherever that is. I want to be near him. I want to be just as powerless as he once was and may yet be. Thank you. I'm just going to turn on the light in this room.
Thank you for that, Ralph.
Well, thank you for your book. Thank you for your book. Do you want me to ask you questions first? No,
Sure.
I want to follow how you imagine this would go.
Yeah, that's fine. However you want to do it. It's good.
So I'm constantly thinking about the kind of invisible, very subtle advocacy work parents, non-disabled parents of disabled children can do. It's a kind of strange coaching because you can't come on too strong. You've got to hold back when you hear things you don't like. You've got to sort of be committed to their movement over time on the issue of what is possible for their kid. And I found this to be a really powerful part of your book. And the project of the book is doing work that has faith in helping people get to where they need to be, parents. So maybe you could talk about this issue.
Yeah, I mean, that's really who I wrote this for. When my daughter was diagnosed, we went to like a bazillion, neuropsychs, PT, OT, all the T's, and my dad is this famous geneticist. So we went to like, this is the guy who's gonna cure your kid and blah, 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 blah. And like, basically they were like, we got nothing for you. Put her in 60,000 hours of ABA. No, we're not going to do that. Like, we had good instincts. But what nobody said, the best anyone said was like, you're traumatized, you need to mourn, and then you need to get your shit together and start fighting for your kid. And the fighting for your kid part made sense to me. The mourning, like, there was this weird disconnect because I actually liked my kid. Was the funny thing. I find her very joyful and fun, and she was the same kid before and after the diagnosis. We just had a few more tools for understanding. But nobody said find your people. Nobody said you need a community, and not just you. Your daughter has a right to have peers, right? You're going to need to meet some adult folks with your daughter's disability to see that it's okay, right? Nobody said this. There was just this weird, like, even the clinicians who I think, were relatively less ableist, they were just like, yeah. And this only increased when she was sort of sorted into the non-speaking pile.
Right.
Because they were still like, if you do enough ABA, somehow magically she's going to speak. So writing this book, I sort of imagined a person like myself who, wants the best for their kid, is willing to fight, all of that, but it's all happening in this weird vacuum. Right. And then in my family, there's a trauma narrative around disability, obviously. In many families, there is actually, one way or another. At best, it's just been cut out of the story. Right. So I think my hope in writing this book was that parents could imagine this not as a trauma, but a normal part of life, right? And that has positive attributes and not in a Pollyannish silver lining way. And see part of their advocacy. I think most parents do want to do well, but most want to do the right thing for the, they want to do right by their kid and to find community and identity. One of my colleagues said, those disability people, they're going to want you in their club. Mm-hmm. Right? Don't talk to that professor as a disabled, what? So I also found I was very out about my child having a disability, that every family has disability in it. Every family story is a disability story if you so choose to tell it, right? So rather than this be this rare, if this were normalized, a normal part of life, right? And this is, I didn't invent this. Disability justice activists are doing this work, but the parent stuff, sort of the best you get is the Andrew Solomon model. And he's like a bazillionaire. He can take it. That book kind of says, compares disabled people to serial killers. I don't know. I don't think I don't think having a child with a disability, I'll go on the record and saying, I don't think that's the same as having a child who's a murderer. Sorry. That equation, really, everyone gave me that book like that was going to help. And I was like, what the fuck is I found it so upsetting. And it all comes from this idea that this, wonderful specimen of humanity, have to accept this damaged goods. And that just did not help me. Is wrong on so many different levels. So I felt like we just needed a new conversation and paradigm and connecting. If we understood this sort of comes also from me as a queer person, a 20th century queer, right? From a moment when I was unimaginable in many ways to my parents, who were nice, liberal, loving, more or less good people. A queer daughter was just an unimaginable trauma who could not fit into the family in some, that doesn't fit into a family 20th century family narrative, right? So I know what it's like to be delineated a little bit, to not have a heritage, to feel like nobody has ever been queer apparently in the history of the universe, right? So I think I said, well, how could we tell a different story? And also, there's a lot of wisdom in the disability community that you need. So it's because I felt very overwhelmed, so I'm supposed to be this expert on this, and I'm not. And I didn't need to be. There was so much to learn from. And I did find, the letterboarding community was, I'm not here to proselytize for them, but it was the first sort of normalizing of autism, which was basically trying to accommodate the needs of my child to learn, as opposed to fix or really warehouse, which is what the schools were doing. So I guess that's my long-winded answer of saying, yeah, I do feel like I don't want to scare parents off. A colleague of mine said, when my kid was first diagnosed, I wouldn't have picked up this book because just the word disability being on the cover, I couldn't say the word, so that's part of why All Our Families is really large, but the press, one more thing on this, they didn't like All Our Families, and they just wanted a super academic-y title. They said it sounded like a 70s TV show sitcom. I was like, and what's wrong with that? But I wanted that because it is All Our Families.
Yeah.
I wanted that to really be the take home in a way that this is a normal, ordinary part of human diversity that has value. And I think for parents, you're just given a bunch of DSM numbers and clinical approaches that mostly were not developed, are medically very useless for people with autism, and kind of cut off from things. And that's what I'm trying to sort of work against.
Here's one more for you. So I'm thinking about queer family making and the possibility of delineating ableism. Like, in other words, I think of my own journey as largely repudiating the family I had. I don't like their political values. I don't like, I mean, there's one exception in my mother, but I just don't care for how they live.
Yeah.
And I don't care for how they responded to my son DJ. And so I'm wondering, is it possible also to be really radical in what kinds of kinship groupings? Maybe because that's also in your book. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I sort of grappled with a bunch of different ways, because I'm coming from a queer world where, like, the party line for queers of my generation, it's very different for younger people, is like, you don't need that sucky family that rejected you. They're just like your family of origin, biological family, and you're going to find this wonderful family of choice, right? That's going to save you, and there are a couple things, like, it's a human need to feel connected to your biological family. Now, you may not be able to do that with a nuclear family and a biological family aren't the same thing. It's one thing. So, and a family system doesn't have to be biological, but a family of origin, I think, has important stories to tell us. And it may not be from that nuclear biological family. It might not be from a biological family at all, but we need lineage, I think. And it did me no good to feel cut off from mine, even though, I mean, they rejected me more than just, because of my queerness, right? So I think, looking beyond, like, the nuclear is a piece of it, or even the biological, just like, what's your ancestry and imagining, even if you can't find them or you don't want to because they suck, just the performative speech act, in a way, since we're both English professors, we're all English professors here, we can use words like that, the performative speech act of imagining there were disabled people in my family, even if I can't recover them. Yeah. I was talking with my partner who's Korean American, and her parents are first generation immigrants. She's like, I don't have access to, most of my family's all in Korea. Like, and I was like, but you can imagine that they were there. Like, that in itself matters. And then, I kind of go into how that family of choice, when you're parenting, can be, very fragile, or it doesn't always provide you what you need in the long run. And a lot of the ways it's been constructed, even in disability justice circles, in mutual aid, is very elderless and childless, is what I notice. So I want a family of choice that includes kin, that includes, multi-generations, that includes care, right? That people can have a lot of needs and not necessarily be able to reciprocate, right? It's not mutual always, right? And because we'll all be there if we live long enough, and we were all infants, it's some weird fantasy that we weren't incredibly needy, right? Once you parent, you see that. So I guess I don't have, like, here's the formula for how to do it, and I think it's going to be different for everyone's situation. But I don't accept that I don't have the double negative, but I don't accept that I don't have a right to a lineage. It would have helped me to know my cousins. It would have helped me. There was a violence to that I'm still living in some way. I thought I remember being sick and thinking, I wonder if they'll give me up, like, we see how people are treated who have needs, So I think, so that's what I'm thinking about in this book. And I think about how my grandfather, who was sort of the patriarch, comes back from being a doctor in the war, and he was sort of a big character, and he was a doctor, but he had a very working class manner, and he was kind of a bro, and this huge house with 1 million people in it, and there was room for mostly dependent women whose husbands had died. There were all kinds of people in that house, in and out of that house. But there wasn't room for someone with an extra chromosome. It wasn't because everyone was like up by their bootstraps, So I think we need to not accept this sort of cutting out thing. And I was interesting, and I don't want to romanticize Black people, like, they don't have fucked up families too. But when I read with my friend David Ambrose Jackson, he was talking about how, like, he's about my age. He's from a Black working class family. And he was saying, like, yeah, in his family, there were autistic people, he had cousins with Down syndrome. And he was like, it would not have occurred to a Black parent of that generation to give up. But that was like something crazy white people did, basically. And he was like, my cousin with Down syndrome used to babysit me. Like, that was just totally normal. So I think this is part of like the pathology of white middle class culture in the US in particular. And sort of, I just really want to open that up and not make this binary between this magical family of choice that I've been waiting for, this queer family that is somehow childless and elderless. And, that doesn't really work for me as the solution. And I think I have a right to my lineage in some way, even if I don't want to be close to, my nuclear family or something. I'm not, like there are reasons not to be, but it's how we make the myth and tell the story as well as the social relations, I think.
Great. Do we want to turn to audience questions for you?
Sure.
Do we have any? I don't know where I might find that.
There's an ask a question at the bottom of the screen. Anyone want to ask a question?
I don't think we have any audience questions, but I actually have a question to kind of follow up on that.
Great.
Which is that so I'm a trans adult that runs a support group for cisgender parents of trans kids who want to be advocates for their children. And it strikes me, and some of those kids also have disabilities, and it strikes me as, that parallel conversation of the advice that that I often find so enraging, and I know disability justice advocates find so enraging, of like, you have to grieve your child before you can move forward, which is, and as you said, like, your daughter's the same person, right? Like, that she's always been, and that is certainly my experience of transness, and often people's experience of their own children, right? Is like, well, I knew my child is the same child, even if their external like markers of how they express their gender shift over time, right? But like, all of our external markers of gender shift over time, or the ways that all of our embodiment shifts over time. And so I'm wondering if y'all as parents can talk about, let me just say this other thing, which is that the thing that I think is great about parents as advocates is that you do have the ability to kind of do this sneak attack thing, right? Whereas if people don't read you as, like, if they don't perceive you to be part of the community, then sometimes they will say things that then you have the opportunity to challenge, which is of course really painful, but also it does give you a way in sometimes. And I think that's often the only way that we are able to challenge the ableism or any of these other things, transphobia or anything else. And so I'm just thinking about your advice maybe to parents who are thinking through, they have a new child, new to them or new in the world child, and getting this kind of, in my opinion, shitty advice that really is about centering their own experience instead of their child's experience. How do we help them reframe? What do you think is a useful reframe for parents?
Oh, it's a little situational. I think it depends on the parent, but I think getting them into community really helps. Saying, it's really important that you meet autistic adults, right? And it's also important that you learn about this disability rights movement that's bigger than the particular diagnosis or impairment or whatever, right? So that, I think, and I say this as like, I'm a very chatty introvert by nature. I'm not really a groupie group person. That's my partner. I'm just not, right? So that was like, but it was transformative for me to be in community with other families rather than with these clinicians where it was just all incurable pathology, basically. So I think that's part of it. And then, Ralph is really the trailblazer on this, but it also becomes about giving your child the space to kind of to start, my daughter was 2.5 when she was diagnosed, so it was hard to take cues from, you can't take cues from a 2-year-old, it won't go well, but any 2-year-old. But as she gets older, it's kind of more like, taking cues from her about how she wants to be in the world and what she wants to do. And, like not thinking of her as a problem to be solved, and sort of sharing that with other parents. When I see, sometimes they're going to go to college and they have this like list of demands on their child. They'd probably be like that with any child, but it cuts a certain way with a child. Like, you're going to have to prove to the world, that we conquered this or something. And I just say, start listening to what your kid actually wants. And, I think that's sort of a subtle thing that I do now is like, oh, I noticed, John is really into cooking, so maybe college isn't what he wants or whatever. And it's just like the same things are true for parenting anybody, right? But it cuts a certain way, I think, around disability and with trans identity as well. The harm is gonna be magnified in some way, in a different way when you impose your expectations than it would with a non-cis kid or a non-disabled. That's my view. Is like you can do more damage in a way. So yeah, and I think Ralph probably has a few things to say about this.
So it's really tricky for parents of disabled kids because they're fighting against so many systems that are designed to exclude their kids. So you have to be able simultaneously to play that kind of warrior role, but then also to recognize, as Jennifer was saying, that they need to meet people like them, not like you. And it's a rare parent that can play both roles, because I remember my son in the 5th grade one night types on his talking computer, "Freak is ready for bed." And at that moment, I knew that despite the massive love avalanche that I orchestrated for my son, everything we had done that was pro neurodiversity, it wasn't enough coming from the parents. It was something. I'm not discrediting it. And we started, as Jennifer suggested, going to conferences with radical autistics so that because one of the great ironies of inclusion is you don't often see other disabled people. He was the first fully included non-speaking autistic student in the state of Iowa. So it's hard to do both of those things. The final thing I would say is, I remember the first time I met my son, takes me by the finger to the couch and starts knocking his head against my head. I had no idea what was going on. He was a non-speaking kid, never met him. Years later, he said, "Dad, I was trying to say hello." And if you can tell someone you're going to get the love you want, but maybe just in another form. And if you're not ready to receive it in another form, then you're really a narcissist.
Right.
That it's not really love.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's sort of learning to take your cues from your child in some way is key. I would also say, there are parents who are disabled, and yes, I've learned a lot from knowing them, and listening to them and how they think about parenting and disability, right? So I think that's another piece of it, just like their parents who are trans, right? I think, especially this is all very gendered, and there's sort of with women. I talk a lot about that in the book. And I think it's not that there's not room for you to have your feelings, right? But the idea, this mourning narrative really bothers me because it presumes that there was like a right kind of child who you were entitled to would be better, and I think that's kind of, that actually damages everyone. Not just like the idea that there's this child, that is narcissistic. I think there's a lot of fear around disability for women because they're doing 99 to 100% of the care work and are asked to be sacrificial, Christian soldiers for the cause while dad goes out in these pet families. I talk about going to these support groups for parents that were 100% women. My partner and I were the only people who were a couple there, So there's an enormous dishonesty around gender and care and race in this country. And if we don't get honest about that, it makes women panic because they're going to be deprofessionalized at best, right? So I think that so they're not just like bad, mean narcissists. There's a whole other piece to it.
No, that's right.
So we have to work on all of that. But when I talk to parents, I think there's also something like, having a certain amount of joy in your life and just sort of like, I really enjoy it. Like not every day, every moment, but overall, the main joy in my life is my daughter, and that's probably unhealthy too. But a lot of adult life is crap, right?
This is the phase. This is the time that she's with you. That makes sense.
Like I really enjoy my daughter, and I don't know. There's a lot to be learned from someone whose brain works differently from you, and then we have a lot of. We are biologically. We're both Finks, and boy, my partner, who's not a biological parent, there's a lot of Fink in her. There's a lot of, and she's a lot like my partner, even though they're not biologically related, because so she's not like this radically other Martian either, but there are things to be learned from a mind that works differently from your own, and a body that works differently. I think like the vacuum that I was put in was really problematic and totally unnecessary. And I don't have the answers to all of it, but that really came from two directions, socially and then from the lack of lineation.
Yeah. As a bookseller, I really do believe that books play a role in the lineation that you're talking about, because people are so isolated and folks are like, well, we have the internet now, so that's so good. And it is good in many ways. But one of the things that, it's very hard when you are a parent, especially a parent of young children, to even find other families sometimes. Right. And so sometimes we really need books like your books to find your people, right? I think that's such a key value of both of your books is or your many books, but these books in particular that we're talking about tonight, because I think this is where representation does still really matter, because I think it's it can be so isolating to really just not be able to find any other families like your own. And one of the gifts of being at Charis is people come in and they are so very specific about their families. They'll say, well, I need a book about a child who was in foster care and is now being raised by their grandma and, had two dads before. And I love that they expect that we have that exact book. And I'm like, great, you totally deserve that book. We don't have it yet. But
right.
But
Ralph's book was one of those books for me for sure. There were very few. It was like finding Soma in the letterboarding community, Ralph's book, not that much more than that. Reading some books by autistic adults that they wrote about their own experiences. And it's not that I'm an overeducated person. I'm the daughter of a scientist. It's very hard for me to not just be like, trust the experts. And I do mostly for scientific information, right? They don't understand anything else. That's where their expertise ends, right? And so it's not about being anti-science or anything like that.
We have a question. We have a question in the chat.
Friend David. Hi, David.
Hi, David.
So he asks, can you talk a little bit more about family, kinship, and community? What is it that makes our close communities feel like family?
Yeah, and I consider David one of our mishpacha, we say in Yiddish, the family that isn't your biological family. See, these are old concepts. We don't have to reinvent the wheels, right? In Yiddish, we say mishpacha, which means the person who, the person you call aunt who isn't really your aunt, right? So I think, David, it's really, the concept of access intimacy that Mia Mingus has developed really helped me think about this. Like, why am I able to have mishpacha with some family kinship communities and not others? It's that sense that when I go to the Fresha Crumby's house, right, and my daughter planks on the sofa, I don't have to apologize or explain. David might plank with her and they might have a great interaction, and we can relax and just be human together. We can have
that's why everybody needs a trampoline house, because there's no appropriate behavior in a trampoline house. I think you're right. Also, shared struggle. I mean, shared struggle and a history of that shared struggle and all the wisdom that accumulates under pressure that can be passed along, and that you're absolutely right. You can let your guard down, and especially if you grew up with unhappy, unaffirming family situations, it's absolutely shocking to discover people who love and admire you. It's just shocking. It's just absolutely shocking.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like the sense that you can be joyful together is wrapped around the shared struggle, right? And that sharing that, my kid is having this struggle. It's neither exhibitionistic, like, let me, that you might, nor is it going to turn into a pity, right? Which is horrible. She'll be seen, and I could talk to Cara and David about, a problem Nadia's having, and they'll still see the other parts of her. She won't become that problem, that issue she's having, and they might be like, oh, we actually know a dentist who's really good with kids like this. There's just shared information, but it's beyond that. It's the sense that we won't be pitied or reduced to most challenging behavior issue or whatever. I mean, I have challenging issues and behaviors. I wouldn't want to be reduced to that, who wants that, right? So
although I will say, once you start seeing 60, your 60th year, I'm happy to be all of the things that my colleagues find me, call me impossible. Well, one last thing about David, it's also fantastic when someone like David knows a really good bottle of wine, when you know nothing about wine, and David can add that as a little extra to the civil rights struggle that we're all facing.
David's definitely the go-to person, right? So, you can just sort of be yourself, and there's just something different about that than, if I go to sort of the inclusion model where, we're going to be made to feel other. We're going to be reduced to our most challenging issues, but not actually get any information or help, and, yeah, so I think that's where you feel kinship and community, as opposed to sort of aid or, you know,
Yeah.
and you know, it's complicated, right? It's not simple, but I do feel that, and David and Cara and Audrey are part of that for us, for sure.
So Chris in the chat asks, could you both please say a little bit about social safety net supports for families raising disabled kids?
Yeah. Oof. I mean, Chris is quite the author himself. Has a really important book that came out a couple of years ago. The social safety net isn't the net it used to be. I mean, the social safety net isn't as safe. Chris tells an incredible story about, high care need children, how much families have to produce this care themselves. I don't know. I think I'd rather hear you talk about it, Chris. Obviously Jennifer can say something. Do you want to add something?
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. And Chris's book is super important. I'm not a policy person, but I think because here's my view. Because we act like disability is rare, right? We think it can be solved on an individual level. And the left and the right, and there's a good critique in the New Republic, actually, of mutual aid as kind of a libertarian approach that shows up on both the far left and the far right, right? And it comes in response to disability. It comes from the fantasy that disability is going to happen to like those other people, not to us, right? 0.5% of children are born with what, the hospital considers a disability. The number of people who legal definition of disability meet it at 60 is 40%, right? But we live in a fantasy world where it's rare and can be solved individually, or either by like mutual aid hippiedom or up by your bootstraps. And that just doesn't work.
No, it really doesn't. It really doesn't.
And I'm one of the most privileged, I am privileged economically in every possible imaginable way. And it's been very, very challenging for us to figure out care, to figure out, so I think, but why it's not that hard to solve in some ways, because there's a core dishonesty. There's a core fantasy that there were no disabled people in my family, right? So the lineage piece. This is rare, unprecedented, and shameful. So unless we shift that, we're not going to be of a mind to do sort of the obvious policy things, is my sense. I tend to be interested in the psychological things that keep us from doing sort of what in some ways are very common sense things. If we thought we'd be part of that 40%, we might, spend our tax money differently and all that. So that's what I really think. And I think affluent people become very like entrepreneurial and individualistic in their solutions, and less affluent people have to rely on these systems which provide care, often, sprinkled with marginalization and abuse, frankly. So
yes. I mean,
those are your options, basically, and they're not options.
No, and in rural America, respite care, you might have to drive 2 hours to get 24 hours of respite care. In foster care, think about the wildly disproportionate number of disabled kids in foster care who have been abandoned or abused. Interlocking social safety net systems that are failing in different places. I mean, I think about my own son who had a very serious vision problem, strabismus that had affected his posture so radically, no one bothered to give him a pair of glasses in his 3.5 years in foster care. it's really, it's a struggle, as Jennifer said, for people with resources. And it's really a struggle for people without those resources living in rural America. Holy moly. I mean, where we are, holy moly.
Yeah.
Well, we're seeing even just in the response to COVID that the cognitive dissonance around disability is so great that people would just rather die. I mean, it's just, that's, I mean, to me, that's this American idea of, well, I'm so tough and strong, like nothing's ever going to happen to me. It's horrific. You know, there's no other word for it.
Yeah.
Are there any organizations or groups or folks that you particularly want to lift up or let folks know about?
That's great. So the Autism Self-Advocacy Network is where I would start if I were looking to learn from autistic people. That's an excellent organization that's by and for autistic people. And they do all kinds of advocacy, but I found reading their best practices, like white papers, really, really helpful for changing my own thinking. The Autistic Women's and Non-Binary Network does wonderful events that you can just zoom into, and you don't have to be a woman or non-binary to participate. And that really show what autistic culture can look like. So those are two that are sort of my go-to. Ralph has some more. I do want to, and this isn't just shameless self-promotion, it's shameful self-promotion. In the back of my book, I added 2 appendices that are, so what do you do as a parent? How do you find your lineage, first of all, or conceptualize it in very practical terms? And then, like, how do you advocate essentially as a parent? How do you find community? What do you do? So I would recommend that at the back of my book. But those are good organizations to start with as you know, those are somewhat autism specific. Actually, the Down Syndrome Foundation, which is just the big, national foundation, is very progressive. They talk and very anti-institutionalization. And they are really trying to, change the conversation. And you can be, I'm as pro-choice as the day is long, right? You can change, but choices happen in content. And what they're trying to do is provide another side of the story about genetic testing and selective abortion, to say the lives of people with Down syndrome are completely different when they're raised in families and in institutions. And this goes back to Arthur Miller, right? And what Ralph was talking about, that the life expectancy, just biological factors, change because they're raised in families. So without any new medicine, the trajectory of the lives of people with Down syndrome has changed widely. So even those mainstream organizations sometimes are really excellent. And in the case of Down syndrome, I think they really are. And I'm sure there are others. I think getting involved with disability justice is really helpful in starting to read. I tried in this book, and I can't help who I am. I'm an academic. I have certain ways of thinking and kinds of training, and that's not a bad thing. But I really tried to include some scholarly stuff, but also some stuff coming from blogs, from Instagram, of disabled people who are self-advocates, who are sort of intervening in these conversations in this sort of lateral media world that we have now. I learned a lot from people like Mia Mingus. I learned a lot from Melissa Blake, just 2 names, and quote and cite them. So I would say following, adults if you have a kid with whatever diagnosis, finding the adults out there who are self-advocates, right? Deej is one of them. Ralph's son is someone who I think for our community is an important person.
Where can folks watch Deej?
So if you just Google Deej the movie, and then how to watch it. There's we don't profit off of the selling of the film, the streaming of the film. It's on PBS all the time, in and off. We chose not to be. We did not want to. We do almost all of our advocacy for free, and are very committed to that project. But you can certainly see the trailer, and then there are a bunch of services that have now made the film free at libraries, public libraries, which we're really happy about. So if
maybe
you go,
like Canopy, is that the Canopy that does movies
yes.
through the library? Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
That's
Yep.
awesome.
And so you can
we
see it
will
there.
Encourage folks to watch it now that we know. And a fun fact, Mia Mingus worked for many years at Charis before she became a famous theorist. So
no!
I've known Mia since probably 1999.
Wow.
That's amazing.
So, well, thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation. And, I think folks are really going to be excited to read your book, Jennifer, and are going to feel very affirmed by this. And I'm excited to watch your son's movie and learn more about your work. So thank you both. And thank you to Crystal Hardy, our wonderful interpreter tonight.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Excellent job. And
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, we will be adding this to our YouTube channel. So that our YouTube channel is just /Charis Circle. So folks can go watch a full array of our backlist there as well. We have we have a whole playlist of parenting videos. So social justice related parenting stuff. So if that is why you're here tonight, more broadly, go check those out. And we also do have other disability justice events up there as well. So thank y'all. I hope that you stay safe and well. And thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone who came. Bye.
Good night.